The dog found her first. Kale Morrow felt the leash go tight in his left hand, watched the line snap rigid from harness to grip, and knew before he even looked down that Bodhi had locked. Not a casual sniff, not the ambiguous head swivel that sometimes meant residual scent trapped in a pocket of debris. A full lock. Ears pinned forward, body rigid as bridge cable, tail dropped to horizontal and frozen there. Bodhi's eyes were fixed on a collapsed section of hull plating 60 meters ahead, where the wreckage of the Covenant carrier Yanthari Ascendant lay broken across the ridgeline like a cathedral split open by a giant's fist. "Mark," Morrow said quietly. Bodhi did not move. Bodhi did not breathe visibly. That was the tell. When the dog stopped panting in heat that would have killed most animals, it meant the scent was live, and the source was close, and the handler needed to stop talking and start moving. The problem was that this was day 9. 9 days since the Yanthari Ascendant had come apart in Kalshara's upper atmosphere and scattered itself across 47 square kilometers of volcanic ridgeline. 9 days since the Joint Interstellar Response Authority had dispatched the recovery flotilla, established the grid, and begun the systematic sweep of wreckage that had already yielded 1,106 survivors, 214 confirmed dead, and 81 still unaccounted for. 9 days during which every scan, every drone pass, every biosensor array in the JIRA's inventory had been deployed, recalibrated, redeployed, and ultimately declared a diminishing probability of further live finds. They had found no one alive for 63 hours. Sector 41, where Morrow and Bodhi now stood in the sulphurous morning light, had been swept twice by drone and once by a 4-person ground team. The sector assessment read CLEARED. The probability of live survivors had been downgraded to less than 2%. The formal recommendation from JIRA Chief Evaluator Tessick was to transition from search and rescue to search and recovery, which was the polite way of saying they should stop looking for the living and start counting the dead. Morrow had read the recommendation at 0400. He had filed it in the pocket of his dust jacket, fed Bodhi half a ration bar, and walked into Sector 41 anyway. Now the dog was locked on a debris pile the drones had already dismissed. "Bodhi, show me." The shepherd moved. Not running, not pulling, but that precise forward trot that meant the dog was following a scent cone to its apex, tracking the invisible architecture of expelled air and metabolic byproduct that no instrument in the JIRA's inventory could match. Morrow followed, picking his way over shattered hull plating that crunched under his boots like frozen leaves. The atmosphere suit's readout showed external temperature at 51 degrees Celsius. Sulfur content elevated but survivable. Wind from the northeast, which meant the scent was being carried from the debris pile toward them, which meant Bodhi had picked it up from range, which meant the source was producing enough biological signature to cut through the ambient volcanic chemistry. Which meant alive. 12 hours earlier, Commander Adesh Singh had stood in the operations tent and drawn a line on the holographic grid map with his finger. "The window is closing," Singh had said. He was not a man who dressed facts in comfortable language. He stood with his hands behind his back and his jaw set and his eyes on the grid, and he spoke the way a surgeon speaks when the anesthesia is running out. "We have 81 souls unaccounted for. Biosensor probability models give us a 12% chance of finding any of them alive at this point, declining to 6% by tomorrow morning, and functionally 0 by the day after. JIRA protocol allows me to maintain full SAR operations for another 48 hours. After that, we transition to recovery." The tent had been quiet. The ground team leaders, 12 of them, sat in folding chairs and did not look at each other. The Yanthari liaison officer, a feathered avian named Counselor Rithani, stood near the entrance with her wings folded tight against her back and her crest flat. She had not spoken in the briefing. She had stopped speaking in briefings 3 days ago. "Questions?" Singh said. Morrow had raised his hand, not high, just enough. Sergeant Morrow, my dog hit on sectors 39 and 41 during yesterday's pass. Both times the ground team overrode on the basis of drone clearance. I'd like authorization to resweep both sectors with canine priority. Singh's eyes had moved to the grid. Sectors 39 and 41 were at the far eastern edge of the debris field, where the Yanthari Ascendant's aft engineering section had come down heaviest. The terrain was bad. The sulfur was worse. The drone sweeps had tagged both sectors as thermally saturated, meaning the ambient heat from the volcanic substrate was masking any biological heat signatures. The drones cleared those sectors, Singh said. The drones are reading volcanic thermals, Commander. The ambient temperature in 41 was 50 degrees yesterday. A Yanthari body runs at 37.8. In that kind of thermal wash, a drone biosensor can't distinguish a living being from a warm rock. But Bodhi doesn't read heat. He reads volatile organics. He hit twice, and both times I was called off before he could run the cone to its source. Singh had studied him for a long moment. Around the tent, the other team leaders were watching. Morrow could feel the weight of their attention. He could also feel the weight of their exhaustion. 9 days in volcanic terrain had ground everyone to bone and duty, and the suggestion that cleared sectors needed resweeping was the kind of thing that made tired people angry. How long has your dog been in the field? 9 days. Rest protocol says. Bodhi will rest when we're done. Singh had looked at the Yanthari liaison. Counselor Rithani had not moved. Her feathered crest was still flat. Her taloned hands were clasped in front of her body, and her eyes, amber gold with vertical pupils, were fixed on the grid map as though it contained a prayer she had given up on. Authorized, Singh said. Take a medic check-in every 2 hours. That had been 12 hours ago. Now Bodhi was moving through the wreckage with the certainty of an animal that had never been wrong, and Morrow was following, and the medic assigned to him, a young corpsman named Halsey, was scrambling to keep up, and the morning light of Kalshara was turning the volcanic ridgeline the color of rusted iron. The debris pile was a compressed mass of hull plating, structural beams, and what had once been a section of the Yanthari Ascendant's passenger compartment. Morrow could see the curve of an interior wall, the shattered remnant of a viewport frame, and a dense tangle of cable and conduit that had collapsed inward like the ribcage of something enormous. The pile was roughly 8 meters high, 12 meters wide, and had been tagged by the drone survey with a yellow marker indicating debris density too high for ground penetration radar to resolve. Bodhi stopped at the base of the pile. The dog's nose was working, nostrils flaring in rapid bursts, reading the scent the way a telegraph operator reads code. Then Bodhi did something Morrow had seen exactly 4 times in 6 years of working with the animal. The dog whined. It was a single sound, low and urgent, and it came from a place in the animal's chest that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with instinct. It was the sound Bodhi made when the scent was close and the source was in distress, and the dog understood, in whatever way a dog understands, that the thing it had found was dying. Halsey, get over here. The corpsman scrambled up. What's he got? Someone alive, under this pile. Bring the cutters. Morrow keyed his comm. Base, this is SAR 7. K9 alert, Sector 41, grid reference Charlie 79er. Confirmed live find. Request heavy lift and extraction team. Over. Static, then Singh's voice stripped of ceremony. SAR 7, confirm live find. Confirmed, Bodhi is locked. Single source buried deep. We're going to need plasma cutters and structural bracing. The debris is compressed. One wrong cut and it pancakes. Copy, extraction team en route. ETA 35 minutes. Commander, we may not have 35 minutes. Morrow was already pulling the portable cutter from Halsey's pack. It was a small unit designed for field work, with nowhere near the power of the heavy equipment the extraction team would bring. But the whine from Bodhi's chest had not stopped, and in Morrow's experience, when the dog made that sound, the clock was measured in minutes, not hours. He began cutting. The hull plating was Yinthari composite, lighter than Terran steel but layered in a way that resisted linear cutting. Morrow worked the plasma beam in a zigzag pattern, carving a channel through the first layer, then the second, then hitting a structural beam that required him to reposition. Sweat ran into his eyes. The atmosphere suit's cooling system was at maximum output, and losing the fight against 51 degrees and the radiant heat of the plasma cutter. Halsey held a portable scanner and called out density readings. Bodhi stood rigid at the edge of the cut, nose pointed down into the growing gap, and the whine became a steady, low vibration in the animal's throat. 4 minutes in, the cutter's charge indicator dropped to 60%. The beam was losing intensity. Morrow adjusted the focal width, narrowing it to conserve power, which meant each cut took longer but penetrated deeper. The math in his head was simple and ugly. The cutter had maybe 20 minutes of working power left. The extraction team was 31 minutes away, and somewhere under this debris pile, a person was dying by degrees. 7 minutes. Morrow cut through the third layer and felt the debris shift. He stopped, waited. The pile settled, groaning, and a puff of dust rose from the gap he had cut. In the dust was a scent that did not require a dog's nose to identify. The sharp, mineral tang of Yinthari blood mixed with something else, something organic and living and desperate. "I can smell them," Halsey said. "So can Bodhi. Keep scanning. Tell me what's below us." "I'm getting. Biosensor is confused by the thermals, but I think there's a void space. About 2 meters below the current cut. Maybe 1.5 meters wide, 3 meters long. It's under the curve of that interior wall section. The wall held when everything else collapsed, created a pocket. A pocket that's been holding for 9 days. If there's an air source, if the environmental systems in that section were still partially functional when it came down. There's someone alive in there, Halsey. Bodhi doesn't hit on dead tissue, not like this." Morrow cut deeper. The cutter's charge dropped to 42%. He hit a secondary beam, thinner than the first, and cut through it in 90 seconds. The debris groaned again, a long metallic complaint that ran through the entire pile, and a section of outer plating shifted 3 centimeters to the left. Morrow froze. If that shift propagated, if the weight distribution changed enough to collapse the void space below, the person in that pocket would be crushed before anyone could reach them. The shift stopped, the pile held, Morrow exhaled and cut again. At 37% charge, the cutter bit through a conduit bundle and a burst of stale, filtered air rushed up through the gap. Morrow breathed it in. It smelled of metal, of recirculated atmosphere, of the particular chemical signature of Yinthari environmental processing, a faintly sweet note that the JIRA training manuals described as analogous to overripe citrus. But underneath that was the smell of blood, old and slow, and underneath that was something else, something warm, something breathing. He cut faster. At 32%, the cutter punched through the last structural layer, and the gap opened into darkness. Morrow dropped to his knees, pressed his face to the opening, and shined his headlamp down. The beam caught the curve of an interior wall, polished Yinthari alloy still holding its shape under the tons of wreckage that had collapsed around it. Below the wall, in a space barely large enough for a human to lie flat, he could see feathers. Dark, matted, streaked with dried blood. And beneath the feathers, the slow rise and fall of a ribcage. "She's breathing," Morrow said. "Halsey, she's breathing." Then Bodhi went in. The dog did not hesitate, did not calculate, did not assess the structural integrity of the gap or the risk of further collapse. The gap was 50 centimeters wide, and the dog weighed 40 kilograms, and the physics should not have worked. But Bodhi flattened his body, tucked his ears, and poured himself through the opening like water through a crack. And before Morrow could say a word, the dog was gone, swallowed by the wreckage. Nothing visible but the tip of his tail and the fading sound of his nails on metal. "Bodhi!" No response. Just the sound of a dog settling, the creak of the interior wall adjusting to new weight, and then the hum. That low, steady vibration that was not a growl and not a purr, and not anything in the canine behavioral literature, but was a sound Morrow had heard 47 times in 6 years, always in the presence of someone who had been lost and was now found. The dual timeline of the operation would later be reconstructed by the JIRA Review Board as 2 interlocking sequences: the 9-day macro arc of the Yanthari Ascendant recovery, and the 4-hour micro arc of the Sector 41 extraction. Both timelines converged on the same point: the moment Morrow's portable cutter broke through into the void space, and Bodhi lunged forward into the gap before anyone could stop him. At the operations tent, Counselor Rithani heard the radio call and walked outside. She stood in the sulphurous light with her wings half spread, which was a Yanthari posture that Morrow would later learn meant something between hope and the refusal to hope, and she listened to the calm chatter without speaking. In the void space, Bodhi found her. She was a Yanthari female, young, perhaps equivalent to a Terran adolescent. She was wedged into a gap between the curved interior wall and a collapsed section of decking, and she was alive in the way that things are alive when they have been dying slowly for 9 days and have not yet finished. Her feathered crest was matted and dark with dried blood. Her left wing was crushed beneath a beam she could not move, and her eyes were closed. Her body temperature, when Halsey finally got a scanner through the gap, read 34.2 degrees, 4 degrees below normal. She was hypothermic despite the 51-degree ambient heat outside the wreckage, because the void space she had survived in was insulated by the debris above and cooled by a leaking environmental conduit that had been slowly feeding her filtered air for over 200 hours. The conduit had kept her alive. The cold had kept her alive. The fact that she had not moved, had not struggled, had conserved every calorie her body could hold, had kept her alive. But the blood Morrow could smell was from an abdominal wound that had been bleeding slowly for days, and the scanner showed her pulse at 22 beats per minute, and the window between alive and not alive was closing with every breath she took. Bodhi had pushed through the gap and laid down next to her. The dog was pressed against her side, and the warmth of a 40-kilogram German Shepherd was radiating into her body, and the low vibration in the dog's throat had changed from a whine to a steady, almost inaudible hum that Morrow recognized. It was the sound Bodhi made with survivors, the sound that meant I found you, and I am not leaving. Bodhi out. The dog did not move. Bodhi. Nothing. The shepherd's dark eyes looked up at Morrow through the gap in the debris, and there was something in them that was not defiance and not disobedience, but something older, something that predated training and commands and the entire edifice of human-canine cooperation by about 40,000 years. The dog had found the wounded thing, and the dog was not leaving the wounded thing, and no command in any language was going to change that. "Fine," Morrow said. "Stay." He looked at Halsey. "The gap is too narrow for me with the cutter. I need to widen it, but if I cut the wrong beam, the whole pile comes down on her, and on Bodhi. The extraction team is 26 minutes away. She's got maybe 15. Her pulse is dropping. I need to stabilize that wound and get heat into her before the extraction team gets here, or they're going to be extracting a body." Halsey stared at him. "You can't get through that gap." "No, but you can." The corpsman looked at the gap. It was perhaps 60 centimeters wide and 2 meters deep, and at the bottom of it was a dying Yanthari adolescent and a German Shepherd that would not move. "I'm going to widen the top by 30 centimeters, Morrow said. "That gives you enough room to slide in feet first with the trauma kit. You stop the bleeding, you get the thermal blanket on her, you keep her pulse above 15. I'll cut the extraction path from the top while you work. What if the pile shifts? Then Bodhi and I will dig you both out." Halsey looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then the corpsman pulled the trauma kit from the pack, stripped off the bulky outer layer of the atmosphere suit and said, "Widen it." Morrow cut. Carefully, precisely, reading the stress patterns in the debris the way he had been trained to read them during the 2-year SAR certification course that most people washed out of in the first month. The cutter's charge was at 31%. He cut the top edge of the gap by 30 centimeters, watched the debris settle, checked the stress, cut again. Halsey slid into the gap feet first, disappeared from view, and began calling out vitals. Pulse 20, respiration 6. The abdominal wound is deep, but it's been clotting slowly. She's lost a lot of blood, but the cold kept the rate down. Applying pressure seal now. Thermal blanket on her. Bodhi is he's lying on her legs. His body heat is actually helping. Pulse 21. She's responding to the pressure seal. Keep talking. Pulse 22. Respiration 7. The wound seal is holding. Her color is it's hard to read Yanthari complexion, but the feathers along her neck are lifting slightly. That's good, right? Circulation returning. Morrow keyed the comm. Base SAR 7. Survivor is Yanthari female, adolescent equivalent, pulse 22 and rising. Abdominal wound sealed in the field, hypothermic, left wing crushed. My corpsman is in the pocket with her. I need that extraction team fast. Singh's voice came back steady. Extraction team is pushing. ETA 20 minutes. Medical transport is being dispatched to your coordinates. Can she hold? She's holding. Bodhi's keeping her warm. A brief silence on the channel. Then, your dog is in the void space with the survivor. Affirmative, he won't leave. Another silence. Then, from someone else on the channel, someone Morrow did not recognize. A single word in Yanthari that carried a weight he could feel even through the comm's flat audio. Pulse 23, Halsey called from below. The dog is licking her hand, her fingers just moved. I think she's conscious. She's looking at me. What's she doing? She's looking at Bodhi. She's Morrow, she's crying. Morrow stopped cutting. He pressed his forehead against the hot metal of the debris pile and closed his eyes for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, he was not a search and rescue handler. He was not a JIRA sergeant with 14 years of field experience and 47 confirmed finds. He was a man standing on a volcanic ridge on an alien world, 9 days into an operation that the model said was over, listening to a corpsman describe a dying girl crying at the sight of a dog. And the only reason that girl was crying instead of dead was that the dog had refused to accept the probability models and the drone clearances and the cleared sector assessments, and had instead trusted the 300 million olfactory receptors evolution had given him, and the 40,000 years of partnership that connected his species to Morrow's. He opened his eyes and went back to work. The cutter was at 19% charge. At the operations tent, Counselor Rithani was listening to the comm feed. She had not moved from where she stood in the sulphurous light. Her wings were fully spread now, which the JIRA cultural liaison would later explain was the Yanthari posture of witnessed grace, reserved for moments so significant that the body could not contain them in a closed position. 2 junior Yanthari officers had come out of the tent to stand beside her. They did not speak to her. They simply stood, and their crests rose slowly, and one of them was shaking. On the ridgeline, the cutter died at 11%, the beam sputtering and failing mid-cut. Morrow set it down, pulled a manual pry bar from the equipment pack, and began working the remaining section by hand. The composite was partially cut and weakened. He wedged the bar into the groove and leaned his full weight against it. The metal bent, slowly, centimeter by centimeter, opening the extraction path wider. His atmosphere suit's shoulder seal popped under the strain. He repositioned and leaned again. Pulse 25, Halsey reported. Respiration 9, she's stable, she's holding my hand. Bodhi is pressed against her whole right side now. I think she can hear the team coming. The extraction team arrived 19 minutes after Morrow's initial call. The lead, a veteran engineer named Okonkwo, assessed the debris pile in 40 seconds and made her calculations. "We can lift the main beam with a portable crane, but we need to brace 3 secondary supports first or the eastern face collapses. 30 minutes. "She has 30 minutes, Halsey called from inside the gap. "Barely." "Then we do it in 20. They did it in 18. Okonkwo's team moved with the precision of people who had been bracing debris for 9 days and could feel structural stress, the way a musician feels tempo. The bracing went in clean, 3 carbon composite struts wedged into load-bearing positions that Okonkwo identified by eye and confirmed with a structural scanner. The portable crane caught the main beam, lifted it 40 centimeters and held. Morrow, working with the pry bar because the cutter was dead, bent the secondary plating that had been pinning the girl's wing. Okonkwo's team slid a rescue board through the widened gap, and Halsey, working in a space so tight he could not fully extend his arms, maneuvered the girl onto the board while Bodhi finally, reluctantly, moved to give him room. The girl came out of the wreckage into the sulphurous light of Kalshara's morning. She was small, even by Yanthari standards, her plumage the color of storm clouds with iridescent edges that caught the sun like oil on water. Her crest was matted, her left wing splinted at an angle that made Morrow's stomach tighten, and her eyes were enormous, amber gold, wet, and fixed on the dog that walked beside the rescue board as the team carried her down the ridgeline. Bodhi walked at a precise distance of 30 centimeters from the board, not because he had been trained to walk at that distance, but because it was the distance at which the girl's hand, extended from beneath the thermal blanket, could rest on the dog's head. At the base of the ridgeline, the medical transport was waiting. The Yanthari physician who took charge of the girl spoke rapidly in a language Morrow did not understand, issuing orders to a team of 3 nurses who moved around the stretcher with practiced urgency. Vital signs were transferred from Halsey's portable scanner to the transport's medical suite. IV lines were placed. Yanthari physiology required a different gauge, a different fluid, a different insertion point than anything in the human medical kit, but the principle was the same: get fluid into a body that had been running on nothing for 9 days. The girl was lifted into the transport, and Bodhi tried to follow, and Morrow caught the leash. "Bodhi, stay." The dog strained against the leash. The girl's hand was still extended. Her fingers, long and taloned and trembling, were reaching for the animal, and she made a sound that Morrow felt in the center of his chest. It was not a word. It was not a cry. It was a small, broken note, the kind of sound that exists in a register below language and above silence, and it meant "don't go." Morrow looked at the Yanthari physician. The physician looked at the dog. The physician looked at Morrow. "Let the animal stay with her," the physician said, in accented but clear Terran standard. "Whatever that creature is, it brought her pulse up more effectively than anything in my kit." Morrow unclipped the leash. Bodhi was in the transport before the clip hit the ground. The medical transport lifted off. Morrow watched it bank toward the field hospital, a bright shape against the iron-colored sky, carrying a girl who had been buried alive for 9 days and a dog who had refused every command, every protocol, and every reasonable assessment of probability to find her. He stood on the ridgeline and watched the transport until it was a point of light against the volcanic haze, and then he stood for another 30 seconds, because his legs were shaking, and he did not trust them to carry him down the slope without a moment to gather what was left of his composure. 9 days. He had been in the field for 9 days without a break longer than 4 hours. He had walked 43 kilometers of volcanic ridgeline. He had consumed a caloric intake that the JIRA medical officer would later describe, in a tone that suggested both admiration and clinical alarm, as incompatible with sustained cognitive function. He had overridden 3 separate ground team assessments that relied on drone data. He had been wrong 0 times. Because Bodhi had been wrong 0 times. Okonkwo was packing up the portable crane. She stopped when she saw Morrow still standing there. "Sergeant, you need water." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're standing on a volcanic ridge in 51-degree heat with a popped suit seal and no shade, and your hands are shaking. Drink water or I'll radio the medical transport to come back for you." Morrow drank water. "That dog of yours," Okonkwo said, securing the crane's hydraulic arm. "How does he do it?" 300 million olfactory receptors. I have a spectrometer with a wider detection range than that. Your spectrometer didn't find her. Okonkwo was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No, it didn't." Halsey was sitting on a rock drinking water. His hands were shaking. His atmosphere suit was torn at both knees and smeared with Yanthari blood from the pressure seal application. "Morrow." "Yeah." "The drones cleared that sector twice." "Yeah." "How did you know?" Morrow looked at the ridge. The wreckage of the Yanthari ascendant stretched across the volcanic landscape, kilometer after kilometer of broken ship and shattered lives. And in all of that devastation, in all of that thermal noise and sulfurous haze and drone-certified emptiness, one animal had smelled one girl dying under 8 meters of composite plating and had refused to stop until someone listened. "I didn't know," Morrow said. "Bodhi knew." The field hospital was a modular unit deployed by the JIRA flotilla on the second day of operations. It had 40 beds, 12 surgical suites, and a staff that had been rotating in 18-hour shifts for over a week. When the Yanthari girl arrived, she was taken directly to surgery. Her abdominal wound required 2 hours of repair. Her crushed wing required another 3. The Yanthari physician who had taken charge of her worked alongside a human surgeon named Dr. Caswell, and the two of them rebuilt the wing's primary flight bone, using a composite splint that Caswell had fabricated from materials that were not in the standard human surgical kit, but that she had improvised from hull plating offcuts and medical-grade adhesive. When Caswell described the procedure to Morrow later, she used the word unprecedented 3 times in 2 sentences. The Yanthari flight bone structure was different from anything in the human anatomical database. It was hollow, like a bird's, but reinforced with a lattice of mineral deposits that gave it tensile strength comparable to carbon fiber. The crush injury had shattered the lattice in 11 places. Caswell had studied the intact right wing, extrapolated the lattice pattern, and hand-placed each mineral fragment into a matrix of adhesive that she had tested on sample material from the debris field during a break between other surgeries 3 days earlier. She had not known she would need it. She had prepared it anyway. "Because you always prepare for the find you haven't made yet," she told Morrow. "That's what you taught me." "I didn't teach you anything," Morrow said. "You taught me that the cleared sectors aren't always cleared." The second surgery on the wing was the one that nearly failed. 2 hours in, the lattice reconstruction began to degrade. The mineral fragments were not bonding to the adhesive matrix at the correct angles. The Yanthari physician, whose name was Dr. Lathy, determined that the fragments needed to be soaked in a calcium phosphate solution that replicated the mineral bath the flight bones developed during adolescence. The problem was that no such solution existed in the field hospital's pharmacopoeia. Lathy dictated the chemical formula. Caswell stared at it for 30 seconds, then walked to the hospital's fabrication unit and spent 45 minutes synthesizing a batch from raw medical-grade minerals, a saline base, and trace elements she extracted from Yanthari blood samples that the hematology lab had on hand. The first batch was wrong. The crystallization pattern did not match. Caswell adjusted the temperature, added a buffering agent she had seen referenced in a Yanthari medical journal she had downloaded to her personal device 6 months earlier during a cross-species surgical conference she had attended on a whim, and produced a second batch. Lathy tested it, looked at Caswell with an expression that contained several lifetimes of professional respect compressed into a single glance, and said, "This will work." It worked. The lattice reconstruction held. The wing would fly again. During the surgery, Bodhi lay outside the operating suite. He did not eat. He did not drink. He did not sleep. He lay with his nose pointed at the sealed door, and his eyes open, and his body arranged in the precise posture of a dog that is waiting for something it considers more important than food, water, or rest. Morrow sat beside him. He had tried once to offer the dog water from a bowl the hospital staff had brought. Bodhi had looked at the bowl, looked at the door, and looked at Morrow with an expression that said, quite clearly, "I will drink when she is safe, and not before." 3 hours into the surgery, Counselor Rithani arrived at the field hospital. Morrow had not spoken to the counselor directly during the 9-day operation. She was the senior Yanthari representative, a member of the Covenant Council's emergency committee, and she moved through the operations area with the quiet, contained authority of someone who had spent decades in positions where her words carried the weight of policy. She was tall for a Yanthari, her plumage a deep indigo black that had gone silver at the edges of her crest, and her eyes carried the kind of weariness that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from watching, day after day, as the number of unaccounted names refused to shrink fast enough. She came into the corridor and stopped when she saw the dog. "This is the animal," she said. It was not a question. "His name is Bodhi," Morrow said. The counselor looked at Morrow. "And you are the handler." "Sergeant Cale Morrow, JIRA Canine Search and Rescue Unit." "You were in the sector the drones had cleared." "Yes, ma'am." "Because your animal indicated otherwise." Morrow considered several responses, considered explaining the science of volatile organic compound detection, the limitations of thermal imaging in geologically active zones, the proven track record of trained search dogs in scenarios where electronic sensors failed. Considered explaining that Bodhi's nose contained 300 million olfactory receptors, roughly 50 times the number in the most sophisticated biosensor the JIRA deployed, and that the dog's brain devoted 40% of its cortex to processing scent information, a ratio unmatched by any artificial system ever built. Instead, he said, "Bodhi doesn't quit." The counselor studied him. Then she looked at the dog. Bodhi had not moved. His nose was still pointed at the surgical suite door, and his eyes were still open, and his body was still arranged in the posture of absolute, immovable patience. "Nor it seems do you," the counselor said. She sat down on the corridor floor across from Morrow. She did not fold her wings. She did not tuck her crest. She sat in the full, spread posture of witnessed grace, her indigo-black plumage fanning out against the white hospital wall, and she looked at the dog. 81 unaccounted, she said quietly. We had prepared ourselves. The council had drafted the memorandum. The formal request to transition to recovery operations was on my desk this morning. The numbers, the probabilities, the thermal models, they all said the same thing, that it was time to stop looking. She paused. Your animal disagreed. Bodhi doesn't read probabilities, Morrow said. He reads scent. What is the scent of someone who has been buried alive for 9 days? Morrow looked at the dog. I don't know what Bodhi smells. I know what he does when he smells it. He locks on and he doesn't stop. Not for heat, not for sulfur, not for cleared sectors, not for probability models. He found a girl under 8 meters of composite who had been surviving on leaking air and body heat for 216 hours. And the reason he found her was that he can detect parts per trillion of the volatile compounds a living body produces, at range, through interference patterns that would bury any electronic sensor we have. Parts per trillion, the counselor repeated. It's a number so small it barely has a physical meaning, but Bodhi smells it the way you and I see daylight. The counselor was silent for a long time. When she spoke, it was in a register that Morrow had not heard from any Yanthari in 9 days of operations. Lower, slower, and weighted with something that was neither gratitude nor sorrow, but some compound of both that the Yanthari language apparently had a name for, and Terran Standard did not. On the Covenant Council we have a term, Korath Ven. It translates inadequately as the one who searches after the searching has ended. It is not a rank, it is not a commendation, it is a recognition of a kind of determination that the Council considers sacred because it is the determination that finds what reason says cannot be found. She looked at Bodhi. We have never applied it to a non-Yanthari. We have certainly never applied it to an animal. Bodhi would probably prefer a steak, Morrow said. The counselor's crest rose slightly. It was, Morrow realized, the Yanthari equivalent of a smile. I suspect he would, but the Korath Ven will be entered into the Covenant's formal record regardless, and your name beside it. The surgical suite door opened. Dr. Caswell stepped out, pulling off her gloves, and her face had the particular expression of a surgeon who has just performed the impossible and has not yet decided whether to be relieved or terrified. She's stable, Caswell said. The abdominal repair is clean. The wing is going to need months of rehab, but we saved the primary flight bone. She's awake and she's asking about, she looked at the dog. She's asking about that. Bodhi was on his feet. His tail moved once, a single slow sweep, and his eyes were on the open door. Can he go in? Morrow asked. Caswell looked at the Yanthari physician, who had come to the door behind her. The physician shrugged, a gesture Morrow suspected had been borrowed from extended contact with humans. The animal appears to have better bedside manner than most of my staff, the physician said. Bodhi did not wait for a formal invitation. He moved through the door with the quiet precision of an animal that had been trained for stealth in disaster environments and walked directly to the bed where the Yanthari girl lay. She was propped up on pillows, her repaired wing immobilized in a complex brace, her storm cloud plumage cleaned and smoothed by the medical staff. Her crest, freed from the dried blood that had matted it, was a soft silver gray, and it rose when she saw the dog. She said something in Yanthari. It was a single word, and Counselor Rithani, standing in the doorway, closed her eyes when she heard it. Bodhi placed his chin on the edge of the bed. The girl's hand found the top of his head, and she held it there, and her fingers pressed into the soft fur behind his ears, and the dog's eyes closed, and the low hum returned, that sound below language and above silence, the sound of an animal that has found the thing it was looking for and does not intend to lose it. Morrow stood in the doorway and watched. He had been in search and rescue for 14 years. He had worked earthquakes, mine collapses, station breaches, atmospheric decompression events, and 3 planetary evacuation operations. He had seen Bodhi find 47 survivors in 6 years of field work, from a child trapped in a residential collapse on Marin IV, to a crew of 11 wedged into an emergency pod in the debris of a transport collision above Sethai Station. Every find was different. Every find was the same. The dog smelled something no machine could smell. The dog followed it with a precision no algorithm could match. And the dog stayed with the survivor until the survivor was safe. And none of it was heroism, because heroism implied a choice, and Bodhi had never chosen. Bodhi simply did what Bodhi was. That was the part people never understood. They wanted to call it bravery. They wanted to call it loyalty. They wanted to attach human words to an animal's behavior and make it fit a narrative about sacrifice and devotion and the noble bond between species. But Morrow had spent 14 years with working dogs, and what he knew, what he had learned in the sulfur and the heat and the dark places where people go to die, was simpler than any of those words. The dog does not decide to search. The dog searches. The dog does not decide to stay. The dog stays. And the gap between a living girl and a dead girl, the gap between found and lost, between hope and memorandum, between the Council's transition to recovery and the Council's core Then, was a gap that no probability model and no thermal sensor and no drone survey could close. A dog closed it. In the days that followed, the story of Sector 41 moved through the recovery operation the way scent moves through air, invisibly, irresistibly, reaching everyone. The JIRA ground teams heard it first, then the flotilla crews, then the Yanthari officers who told their colleagues on the orbiting Covenant ships, who told their families on Yanthara, who told the Council. The Yanthari word for what happened in Sector 41 entered the operational lexicon within 48 hours. The ground teams started using it first not as jargon, but as shorthand. When a sector was cleared by drone but felt wrong, when the probability model said 0 and the gut said otherwise, when a handler wanted to resweep and the team lead was about to overrule, run the core Then, meaning, send the dog, meaning, trust the thing that doesn't calculate. Within a week, 3 more handlers from the JIRA K9 unit had been rotated to the Kalshara operation. Within 2 weeks, K9 sweeps had found 7 additional survivors in sectors previously assessed as cleared. Each find was in a thermal saturation zone. Each find was in debris the drones had tagged as too dense for ground penetration radar. Each find was made by a dog whose nose could detect molecular traces at concentrations so low they were measured in parts per trillion concentrations that the JIRA's best electronic sensor arrays could not distinguish from background noise. The conversation on the Council floor, as relayed tomorrow by Councillor Rithani 2 weeks after the extraction, lasted 4 hours. It covered the technical specifications of canine olfaction, the history of search and rescue dogs on Earth, the certified find rate of trained canine units versus electronic sensor arrays, and the specific details of Sector 41. The Council reviewed the drone survey data that had cleared the sector. They reviewed the biosensor logs that had shown no viable life signs. They reviewed the thermal model that had predicted less than 2% probability of survival. Then they reviewed the fact that a dog had walked into that sector and found a girl. The vote to formally request the establishment of a joint Terran-Yanthari canine SAR training program was unanimous. It was the first time the Covenant had ever requested Earth's assistance in any operational capacity. It was also the first time the Council had voted unanimously on anything in 6 years. Morrow received the request through JIRA channels. The official language was diplomatic and careful, the kind of prose that committees produce when they want something very badly but have spent centuries training themselves not to show it. Translated from the formal register, it amounted to 4 words: "Teach us your dogs." He read it twice, set it down, and looked at Bodhi, who was asleep on a folding cot in their quarters with one paw hanging off the edge and his nose twitching in whatever dream a search dog dreams. Morrow had been offered a promotion after Kalshara, a desk position at JIRA headquarters, coordinating canine deployment across the interstellar response network. He had turned it down the same day, for a reason that the JIRA personnel officer did not understand, but that anyone who had ever worked a dog would have understood immediately. You do not take a working dog off the line and put his handler behind a desk. Not while the dog can still work. Not while there are still people to find. "They want more of you," Morrow said. The dog's ear rotated toward Morrow's voice, considered it, and rotated back. The paw did not move. The nose continued twitching. The girl's name was Shorth. Morrow learned this 3 weeks after the extraction, when Councillor Rithani contacted him through official channels with an invitation to visit the rehabilitation center on Yanthara where Shorth was recovering. The invitation was polite and formal, written in the precise, slightly archaic Terran standard that the Covenant diplomatic corps favored, and it included a note at the bottom, handwritten in a script Morrow could not read but which Rithani had translated beneath. "She asks for the animal every day." Morrow took Bodhi to Yanthara. The JIRA granted him 10 days of leave, which was twice the standard allocation, and which Morrow suspected had been authorized by Singh personally. The transport from Earth to Yanthara took 3 days through the standard relay corridors. Bodhi spent the journey in Morrow's quarters, sleeping in the particular way of old working dogs deeply, but with one ear perpetually cocked, as though even in sleep the animal was monitoring the environment for the sound that would call him back to work. On the second day of the transit, a Yanthari trade delegation that was sharing the transport approached Morrow in the common area. There were 4 of them, mid-ranking diplomatic staff, and they stood at a respectful distance and stared at the dog with the kind of intensity that suggested they had heard the story and had come to verify it with their own eyes. Bodhi, sensing their attention, lifted his head and regarded them with calm disinterest. One of the delegates reached out a cautious hand. Bodhi sniffed it, apparently found it unremarkable, and returned to sleep. "He is smaller than I expected," the delegate said. "They usually are," Morrow replied. The rehabilitation center was a sprawling complex on the coast of a warm sea, built of pale stone and open to the sky in the Yanthari fashion, with courtyards and gardens and wide corridors where the coastal breeze carried the scent of salt, and something floral that Morrow could not identify but that Bodhi found deeply interesting. The staff were Yanthari medical professionals who treated Morrow with careful courtesy and Bodhi with undisguised fascination. None of them had seen a dog before. Several of them asked if the animal was dangerous. "Only to anyone who tries to stop him from doing his job," Morrow said. They found Shurth in a garden courtyard, sitting on a low bench with her repaired wing extended in a rehabilitation brace that allowed limited movement. Her plumage had recovered its color, the storm cloud gray now shot through with iridescent blues and greens that shifted as she moved. Her crest was up. She was looking at the garden entrance when they walked through it, and her eyes, amber gold and enormous, found Bodhi before they found Morrow. The sound she made was the same sound she had made in the medical transport on Kalshara, that small note below language and above silence. But it was not broken this time. It was clear and full, and it meant something that Morrow did not need a translator to understand. Bodhi crossed the courtyard at a dead run, which was a violation of every protocol Morrow had ever taught him, and which Morrow did not attempt to correct. The dog reached the bench, put his forepaws up, and placed his chin on Shurth's lap, and the girl's hands came down on his head and held him, and she leaned forward until her face was pressed against the fur between his ears, and the sound she was making changed into something that might have been laughter and might have been weeping and was probably both. Counselor Rithani was standing behind Morrow. He had not heard her approach. 9 days, the counselor said quietly. She was in the dark for 9 days. The conduit gave her air. The cold kept her alive. But what she tells the physicians, what she has told every person who has asked her how she survived, is that she heard something. On the 9th day, through the metal, a sound she did not recognize, an animal's voice. And she knew, she does not say how she knew, only that she did, that something was coming for her that would not stop. Morrow watched Bodhi and Shurth. The girl's fingers were deep in the dog's fur. The dog's tail was sweeping slowly across the courtyard stones. The coastal breeze moved through the garden and carried the scent of salt and flowers. "She said something when Bodhi first came into the recovery room," Morrow said. "One word, you closed your eyes." Rithani was quiet for a moment. "She said Rithavan. It is not a word that translates well. The closest Terran approximation would be the one who comes. But that is insufficient. Rithavan carries a weight that the one who comes does not. In our oldest texts, it refers to the being that finds you in the dark when the dark has taken everything else. It is the last word in the Covenant's oldest prayer, and it is the first word a Yanthari child learns when it learns about faith." She paused. "Shurth spoke it to a dog." Morrow did not say anything. There was nothing to say. He stood in the garden of a rehabilitation center on a world he had never seen before, watching a German shepherd lie in the lap of a feathered alien girl who had been buried alive for 9 days. And the gap between worlds, between species, between every taxonomy the galaxy had ever invented to separate one kind of living thing from another, was 30 centimeters of warm fur and a heartbeat that would not stop. 2 months later, the first class of Yanthari handlers arrived at the JIRA canine training facility on Earth. There were 12 of them, selected from the Covenant's Emergency Response Corps, and they were tall and feathered and visibly terrified of the German shepherds waiting for them in the training yard. Morrow was their instructor. "The first thing you need to understand," he told them on the first morning, standing in the training yard with Bodhi at his side and 12 Yanthari handlers staring at him with a mixture of determination and apprehension, "is that you do not train a search dog. You partner with one. The dog already knows how to search. It was born knowing. Your job is to learn how to listen to what the dog is telling you, and to trust it when everything else, the sensors, the drones, the probability models, says the dog is wrong." He looked at them. Their crests were flat with concentration. Their taloned hands were gripping the leashes of the dogs they had been assigned, dogs that were pulling and sniffing and wagging, and generally behaving like dogs, which was clearly a source of considerable alarm. "The sensors will lie to you," Morrow said. "The drones will miss things. The models will tell you the probability is 0, but the dog does not calculate probability. The dog smells life. And when the dog tells you there's someone alive under 8 meters of composite in a sector the drones have cleared twice, you follow the dog." He paused. "Always follow the dog." Kesseth, a young female with russet-brown plumage and a crest that had not flattened once during the entire first day of training, raised her hand. "Sergeant Morrow, what if the dog is wrong?" Morrow looked at Bodhi. The dog was sitting calmly, watching the Yanthari handlers and their new partners with the expression of a veteran observing recruits. His tongue was out. His tail moved once. "In 6 years and 400 field deployments," Morrow said, "Bodhi has never been wrong, not once. He has found 48 survivors in conditions that would have defeated any scanner in the JIRA's inventory. The question isn't whether the dog is wrong. The question is whether you're willing to trust something you can't measure, can't quantify, and can't explain to a review board." He looked at the 12 handlers. "That's the hard part, not the training, not the field work, trusting the dog." Over the following weeks, Morrow watched the Yanthari handlers go through the same arc he had seen in every human handler class he had ever trained. First the caution, holding the leash too tight, flinching when the dog pulled, interpreting every bark as a potential threat. Then the tentative trust, loosening the grip, following when the dog changed direction, allowing the animal's instincts to override the handler's assumptions. Then the moment. Every handler had a moment. It was the first time the dog indicated on something the handler could not see, could not smell, could not detect with any instrument, and the handler made the decision to follow anyway. For Kesseth, the moment came during a rubble field training exercise on the 3rd week. Her dog, Atlas, locked on a buried training decoy 40 meters from the nearest marked location. The exercise coordinator told Kesseth the sector was clear. Kesseth looked at Atlas, looked at the coordinator, and said, in a voice that carried the particular weight of someone who had learned a lesson from a story she had heard rather than a mistake she had made, "The dog says otherwise." The decoy was there. Atlas had been right. The coordinator marked the exercise as passed, and Kesseth knelt beside Atlas and ran her taloned fingers through the dog's fur, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone who has just discovered that the universe contains a category of trust she had not previously known existed. Morrow watched from the observation deck and said nothing. He did not need to. The dog had taught her. 6 months after that, a Yanthari colony transport was caught in a debris field off the Selleck Narrows. 3 sections of the vessel broke apart during emergency maneuvering. 140 passengers were unaccounted for. Drone biosensors cleared the wreckage after 72 hours and recommended transition to recovery. Kesseth walked into the cleared wreckage with a German shepherd named Atlas. Atlas locked on a debris pile the drones had dismissed. They found 19 survivors. The Selleck Narrows report made the interstellar news feeds. The headline the Covenant Press Corps ran was simple, and for a species that measured its communications in elaborate formal registers, remarkably blunt. The human animals found them. Below the headline was a photograph of Kesseth and Atlas, standing in the wreckage field, the dog leaning against the Yanthari handler's leg with the easy familiarity of a partnership that had taken 6 months to build and would last a lifetime. Morrow saw the photograph in his quarters on Earth, where Bodhi was lying on the floor beside his chair. The old dog's muzzle was almost entirely gray now. His hips were stiff in the mornings, but his nose still worked, and when Morrow opened the door to the yard each evening, Bodhi would stand on the step and sample the wind with the focused intensity of an animal that was still, always, searching. Counselor Rithani delivered the report to the Covenant Council. She did not explain the technology. She did not cite the volatile organic compound detection rates or the olfactory receptor counts or the cortex allocation ratios. She said only that a dog had walked into the wreckage, and the dog had found living people where the machine said there were none, and the dog had stayed with them until they were safe, and this was what the humans had given them. Not ships, not weapons, not technology they could not reproduce. A dog that does not stop. The council received the report in silence. Counselor Rithani closed with a single sentence, delivered in the formal Yanthari register reserved for matters entered into the permanent record. She said, "They sent us the Rithavon." On Yanthara, in a garden courtyard by the warm sea, Shurth sat on a low bench with a German shepherd beside her. The dog was old now by Terran standards, 10 years of service written in the gray at his muzzle, and the careful way he lowered himself onto the warm stone. His nose still worked. His eyes still tracked movement in the garden. His ears still rotated toward sounds that no one else could hear. Shurth's wing had healed. She could fly again, though the physician said she would always favor the right side, and the primary flight bone would ache in cold weather for the rest of her life. She was enrolled in the Covenant's Emergency Response Academy. She had been the first Yanthari handler to graduate from the joint program with a perfect score. Her dog's name was Bodhi. Not the original Bodhi. The original had retired to Morrow's home on Earth, where he slept on a bed that was too soft for him and ate food that was too rich, and occasionally, when the wind carried a scent that interested him, stood at the door with his ears forward and his body rigid and his tail at horizontal, and Morrow would look at him and say, "Not today, old man." And the dog would huff and lie back down and dream of wreckage and sulfur, and a girl who had spoken the oldest word in a language he would never understand. The Bodhi beside Shurth was young, a descendant of the original, bred from the same line, trained by Morrow himself during Shurth's years at the academy. He had his ancestors' nose and his ancestors' temperament, and his ancestors' absolute, infuriating, magnificent refusal to quit. Shurth ran her hand along the young dog's back. Her taloned fingers combed through the fur with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent years learning how to read an animal that did not speak her language but understood her perfectly. The dog leaned into her touch, his tail sweeping the warm stone. She said a word. It was a Yanthari word spoken quietly, meant only for the animal beside her. The same word she had spoken in a hospital room on a volcanic world, 9 days after the sky had fallen and the dark had taken everything, and a sound had come through the metal that she did not recognize, but that she knew, in whatever way a dying girl knows, meant she was not alone. Rithavon. The dog looked up at her, his ears rotated forward, his nose twitched. Then he laid his head in her lap, and the sound that filled the garden was the sound of breathing, steady and warm and alive. And it was the quietest sound on Yanthara, and it was enough.